Okay, awesome. Welcome everyone. We're going to give everybody a couple of minutes to start joining and we'll get started. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started, and I'm sure folks will join. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on a Tuesday evening in August. I hope folks who are here have some snacks and a beverage of choice for this third edition of our Thinking Big series, where we talk to authors whose work we find inspiring and sort of relevant to understanding what is going on in our world right now. So it's great to see, many folks tuning in. Quickly to start, for those who don't know me, I'm Nidhi Hegde, Director of Strategy and Programs here at the American Economic Liberties Project and co-lead of our Access to Markets initiative, which works with small businesses and entrepreneurs. Economic Liberties, we're a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that works on questions of market power, structure, and policy. And I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Morgan Harper, who's our Director of Policy and Advocacy, and who, among her many talents, has run for office and has been organizing in Ohio, something that we will talk about later this evening. So this evening, we are thrilled to host Brandi Collins-Dexter to talk about her upcoming book, Black Skinhead, Reflections on Blackness and Our Political Future. So this book is coming out in September. I have it. I don't know if you can see this in my blurred screen with Zoom. But the link to pre-ordering it from your independent bookstore, although it's also available on Amazon, is there in the live chat, but make sure you get it from your independent bookstore. It already has rave reviews. Before we get into the actual program, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. So we want this to be a conversation. So throughout the evenings, please drop any questions you may have into the Q&A on the Zoom or on YouTube or on Twitter. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Also, tonight's discussion will be available tomorrow on our website at economicliberties.us. So, you can share the recording with friends who might be interested in this. And this is, as I said, a part of our series. So in September, we will be hosting Columbia Law professor Kate Judge to discuss her new book, Direct: The Rise of the Middleman Economy and the Power of Going to the Source. And on October 25th, we'll be joined by Financial Times journalist Rana Faruher on her upcoming book, Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. So make sure that you sign up for those as they come. All right, so let's get started. I'm just really excited that we are talking to Brandi today about her upcoming book. A quick sort of background to her: in addition to being an author, Brandi is the Associate Research Director at the Technology and Social Change Project at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center, a member of Economic Liberties Board of Directors, an advisor to our Access to Markets initiative, and also a veteran leader of many campaigns holding corporations like Google and Facebook accountable. So in this book, Black Skinhead, Brandi actually explores the fragile relationship between Black voters and the modern day Democratic Party. So one could say this conversation with the midterms coming up in November is extremely timely, and also with 2024 not being that far away. And this is not your typical political analysis book written by, one of those pundits, but on Black voters. What makes it so different is that it really features personal stories from the many, many formal and informal interviews she has conducted across the country with a range of Black voters. She has really deftly woven the role of Black culture and how that has influenced and informed Black politics. And you really come away challenging the notion that Black people are team blue, team Democrat, no matter what. And so I learned a lot reading this book. There were warnings on how fractured Black politics actually really is when you look under the hood, but also a lot of hope on how we could maybe move forward together. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Brandi, and I'm gonna, hand it over to her to give us an overview of the book. And maybe you can also share what compelled you to write this and the thinking behind the title of the book. Skinhead is not has like certain connotations in like popular culture today. And I will say that it definitely turned some heads when I was carrying the book through an airport. So I would love to like learn more about like, why do you write this book? What's it about and the title? Over to you.
Yeah. I like a little bit of clickbait, like anyone else. And so definitely there's a sort of eye-catching aspect to that title I was seeking, but it does have a deeper context to it. So where do I start? So starting with the question, like why or how I started to write the book. To be honest, I never thought I was going to write a book. I didn't really see myself as a writer. As you mentioned, I was doing campaign work at Color of Change, and was starting to see through our work on culture, media, and tech justice and economic justice, a couple of different trends online in terms of how conversation and particularly Black discourse was playing out online in all of these like political and quasi-political spaces, and the ways in which communities were very fractured in our conversation in a way that hasn't historically actually been true for Black people as voters, as organizers, as communities. A lot of our work historically has tended to happen together across different political, ideological lines in service of a greater sort of economic agenda. But what I started to see through, our work at looking at tech was that, through algorithmic segregation, amongst other things, communities were becoming increasingly more divided and not really finding each other. And so I was interested in this sort of through the lens of mis and disinformation and malinformation, and how inaccurate information gets passed through social spaces and moves offline. But really, to me, it became more this story of the decline or death of community shared spaces and public spheres, Black-owned businesses, media, religious spaces, many things that were lost in the 2008 recession and other spaces where we would be able to find and negotiate as a community, that were disappearing. And then what we were seeing in terms of the trade-offs of that. And so I started writing or researching the book I started researching for the book in 2019. Writing of the book took place mainly in between late summer of 2020 and spring of 2021. So that's where a lot of the interviews and things that I do in the book take place. But really, I would say that I think that the elements that shaped the background for the writing of this book really go from, I would say, 2005 to about 2015. So there's about, I would say, 5 or 6 markers in there that I want to quickly walk through. So the first moment, 2005, is Hurricane Katrina. And that public moment where we see very clearly the hurricane ripping through Louisiana, a lot of people displaced, disproportionately poor, disproportionately Black, failure of infrastructure, rise of disaster capitalism, failure of government. And within that, a kind of call to action from somebody who kind of figures in the book pretty prominently, Kanye West. So you see Kanye West doing this telethon for Hurricane Katrina, going off script, while people are talking about, Hurricane Katrina and raising money. And he talks very specifically about the failures of media and infrastructure that have left people literally crying for help. And to the point where even he turns his back when he's like watching television, and he utters this sentence, "George Bush doesn't care about Black people." And in some ways, it becomes the beginning of this kind of like galvanizing moment around really challenging government. You also see at this time the rise of social media platforms, which will figure in much later, but you also see Kanye as this like cultural figure in a slightly different way than purely a musician or artist even, but really either moving culture or, trend-spotting culture, however you want to say it. And I think for me personally at that time, being in my 20s, I was definitely drawn to him as a figure. And I come at this book, I talk about Kanye. Black Skinhead in a lot of ways comes from the song Black Skinhead from the Yeezus album, which I'll talk about later. But, I write this book with Kanye as this background figure as something of a fan, but also examining him specifically as a political figure. I don't get into aspects of his personal life, but looking at statements that he's said about culture, about politics, about why he's a Republican. So that's kind of like the first moment, I would say. The second moment that influences the book is actually a personal one. So after I was in law school, graduating law school in 2005, and after that, I moved to the UK for 2 years. And while I lived in London, there was a rise of what would, I think, be a more modern iteration of the neo-Nazi party. I remember being on the tube or the public transportation in London and seeing these skinheads hanging around. They were actually shockingly polite, interestingly enough, but I didn't really fully understand what I was seeing in terms of kind of like a new wave movement. I thought neo-Nazis were a thing of the past. I didn't realize I was watching like a sort of resurgence of the British National Front. But around the same time, the movie This Is England came out, which talked about the rise of the skinhead. And that first piqued my curiosity. I definitely want to give credit to Yolande Grant, who was my researcher who I worked with a lot on this book, who talked about skinheads as actually the original multi-racial, multi-ethnic subculture of the UK in the 20th century. So for a long time, it was a predominantly, I guess, what we would call white state. I mean, terms like white didn't necessarily exist in the same way back then, but after World War II, a lot of the UK was devastated, and there was a lot of need of medical support, of a lot of a new workforce to come in. And so they went to the colonized countries in the Caribbean, like Jamaica and others, and literally sent boats and brought boatloads of workers into London. And that working class and the generation that came after that was kind of the first generation of kids that were working, living, and processing culture together of different races and ethnicities. And from that emerges the skinhead subculture, which is anchored in ska music, reggae, aesthetic that's uniquely working class England. But like that movement was particularly, even though it seems non-political, was really a part of building this like working class identity. And as more Thatcherism came in, we saw, economic decline, a lot of people being pitted against each other. We saw the rise of the white nationalist skinhead, or the fracturing of that community. And so that concept, or this idea of skinhead as a searching working class subculture, was really something that spoke to me in the ways in which economic fractures and the zero-sum narrative breaks apart communities. And so that was kind of the thing that led me to play around with this concept of skinhead and the idea of nationalism in America, and particularly a type of like Black nationalism that we've seen for a long time that's emerging. So I think that, coupled with the 2008 recession, the rise of Obama as a symbol of representation, the rise of the tech barons, and then you see BLM occupying the Tea Party, all of these different movements, that shifts the way we communicate, the way we understand each other, the way we work together. And it's also shifting the way in which we engage politically. And that was the story that I wanted to tell. And so that's the story that I told through a series of different essays, really looking at different Black voters, conscious non-voters from the Black community, people that identify as leftists, people that identify as Black MAGA, people that don't feel like they have a political identity, but need political intervention, and really looking at that sort of rise of disillusionment that we see amongst different communities. I rambled, I'm so sorry. So I'm gonna pause there, but let's get into the conversation. You muted.
You're on mute, Nidhi.
Oh, sorry. You think I know how to do this after 3 years of I think one of the things that is like particularly like sort of, which I found so interesting about this book, was the range of like Black, people that you spoke to, from like Black MAGA, Black kids who were MAGA, who identified as MAGA, like, folks who were content creators, but like on like everything from TikTok to OnlyFans, who saw themselves as like, maybe on the left, like on the Democratic side, but still quite working it out, all the way to like, more your regular Democratic Party voters. So there was really this like huge like range, not something that we actually hear about often in the news, or like, you know, maybe it escapes a little bit on Twitter. So maybe you can like, I think, and this also relates to issues that we work on, like one thing that a theme that you bring up in the book is that, yeah, there's representation, but, you know, framing and how stories are told is really important. And the lack of like Black owned media, the decline of that really has like, you know, been a powerful force in how stories get framed about Black people and the notions that exist about them as people, as political voters. So yeah, like was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about one, like, you know, from your previous work, how you saw that, but also like, did people realize, like, were there reactions from the folks you were interviewing about how they were being framed? Like, is that something that they noticed and like they were angry about, that there wasn't good representation there?
I mean, that definitely. So I guess I should come back and say that the Black Skinhead is Black political figures and people that live outside the bounds of the kind of fetishized Black democratic. So they're people who either, even if they vote democratically, begrudgingly, but don't see that as a part of their identity, or they're people that have like.
You got a little harder to hear you, Brandi. Maybe get closer.
Or it's people that have like opted out of voting for the Democratic Party and are organizing in different ways. And so it was really important for me to talk to as many different people that didn't fall into that sort of capital D Democrat storyline as possible. So I spoke to folks that were organizing third party for Nina Turner going into the 2020 election. I talked to people that were Black MAGA, people that were maybe libertarian, but didn't necessarily consider themselves to be full-on Republicans. And then I spoke to people who, you know, said that they intentionally didn't vote because they didn't see it as benefiting them. And throughout that storyline, it was a consistent theme of feeling like in the media, they weren't represented, their voices weren't being heard, their concerns, their preferred candidates for those who did vote weren't the people that were being uplifted either by mainstream media or by the Democratic Party. And so even when people didn't necessarily understand concepts like media justice or the storyline of media failures or framing as we talk about it, over and over again was this theme of, I don't see myself in people that they talk about. Like, you know, I don't see myself even in political figures. I don't know who they're talking to. And particularly in the moment when now President Biden goes on a radio show, a Black radio show, and says, if you don't know who to vote for between me or Donald Trump, then you ain't Black. I think that was one of those like major moments where a lot of people were like, wait a minute, we didn't necessarily decide that we wanted to vote for Joe Biden quite yet, or that he was the candidate for us. So that distinction, both between media framing and also the absence of community, locally owned and controlled media as a vehicle for storytelling, was definitely something that people articulated, even if they didn't have like some of the language or policy interventions that we talk about.
Yeah, I think that one of the sort of things that I think you say this in the book is that, I mean, there's a problem of framing, but even when there is like representation, and I actually have this like marked out, so I'm gonna read it out from the book, where you're like, you know, Black people are visibly present at all levels of power in America. And, you know, there could be more of us, but representation without material gain is not enough. And I think that's the thing that also came through when you were talking about like the media and like content creators and like Hollywood. Like, yes, you know, there are more people telling stories, that's great, but they actually don't control it. Like they're not like sort of the producers, the, you know, sort of even the financial control behind all of this, right? And that definitely determines how this happens. And as our economy has gotten more like consolidated and monopolized, like that is something that we're seeing. And that definitely sort of like, you know, I think came through in the stories that you were telling and talking about, like, you know, some of the emotions that folks were like expressing. But I don't know, was that something that you were trying, like, how have you sort of seen that landscape like shift with like tech and the, you know, with like YouTube and creators and Facebook and like those becoming the spaces where like, you know, the intermediaries for like media and storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, where to start on this? I think there's a few places to start. So one, you know, one of the things that is important, I think, to note here is that Black people traditionally have been amongst the fastest users of new communications technology, whatever that's been throughout history. And one of my friends, Joe Torres, talks about this in News for All the People. So I would be remiss if I didn't like shout him out in that work there. But whether it is, you know, newspapers, radio stations, television, the internet, every time a new communications technology comes around that allows not just Black people, I would say, but marginalized people, people who are left out of mainstream discourse, every time those things are available, there's a race to leverage that as a means to organize, to share your story, to create a safe space. And what tends to happen time and time again is that you know, corporate entities, those in power, those that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, tend to step in and swallow everything up and kind of cut off those pipelines to free flowing communication. And so whether you're talking about that with the consolidation of newspapers and what type of news that we get, or whether or not we're talking about that with the internet, one of the things that we've seen is that a lot of spaces in which, you know, I would say Black, LGBT plus, like other users tend to gravitate towards early on, it hasn't been long before Facebook or Google or some other entity has come and swallowed it up. And they always say to you, well, things will be the same. Don't worry about it. They'll be better than ever. But we find that on a lot of levels, that's not always true. People become more surveilled. They become more targeted. They have less control over their information and data, and even less control over their creative content, which is something that we've seen with like, you know, TikTok fallout and a number of other different things. And so that story, so there's two stories there to me. Like there's the story of how corporate consolidation and power has really limited Black people's ability to build an economic agenda for liberation. And there's also the story of the way in which representation is used as a substitute for building power at scale. So what we've seen, you know, particularly with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts and moving forward, is that a lot of the business of diversity has moved to corporations. They've moved to HR. They've moved to these other different entities instead of government. And part of what we've also seen from that is that you'll see a couple of, you know, Black executives or, you know, Black business owners or people that are pushed out in front and shown to the world so people can pat themselves on the back and say, hey, we're achieving diversity, we're achieving equity. But when you look at tangibly what sort of economic benefits that Black people have had over time at scale, like whether the floor is being lifted or we're just drilling holes into the ceiling, we find that unfortunately, that kind of like rainbow neoliberalism can become a barrier to a true economic empowerment for us at scale. And that's definitely something that was in my mind as I was reading and thinking about it. And Morgan, I'm curious for you, because I know we've talked about this. Actually, I'd love to hear from both of you, but I know Morgan, you've thought about this. I know you've talked about this in your various campaigns as well for Congress and Senate. And I would love to know, how are people talking about this on the ground? Were some of the things that I mentioned in the book, did they feel resonant or challenging for you?
Yeah, well, one, I just have to say, anyone who, I don't know exactly how old you are, Brandi, but I felt like this book was speaking to Black millennials. So this is the book for Black millennials who have grown up with Kanye. And I really, I want to also reiterate what you said about, you know, in some ways I'm grateful to Kanye, which with all the baggage I know can be a controversial thing to say, for these moments where he had the collective consciousness and he decided to take us to a higher understanding of what's going on around us and to really drill down on who has power in this country, who doesn't, and how are we as a Black community potentially losing out, and how some things are being lost forever in certain moments. So I'm grateful to him for that education. It was interesting to see you weave that in throughout the book, in addition to some G chats, which I also appreciated, that were true millennial experience. But, I'll say a lot of the things that you mentioned in the book, the people that you interviewed, reminded me of moments that I've had in my own political journey, and especially in Ohio. 2019, 2020, meeting people who were organizing for Trump, Black people with t-shirts, excitement around that. And I had to check my own biases of, well, where's this coming from? Why do you support this person? What is being said that makes you think this is a better route for us than the Democratic Party? And like you mentioned in the book, for a lot of people, it is this sense that we are taken for granted and that we have not seen the material gains for our community over decades of supporting, for the most part, supporting one party, the Democratic Party. And so people are looking at different options. And, especially when we're talking about, and this is something I'd be interested in both of your views on, but for me, especially when we're talking about people who are bearing the brunt of an economic system that has not brought larger gains, I have empathy there. I am kind of, curious about where that's coming from. And we need to listen to that. And I say we, as a Democrat, as a young person, as a Black leader, as someone who cares about public policy, we all need to be listening to that, in my opinion, and not dismissing it. But yeah, it's a little bit of a check your privilege moment, though, of like, wait, I thought we were all on the same page. It's like, no, we are on very different pages, and some of the class differences as well that we need to consider as organizers. But yeah, would love to hear more about if you had that same shock. I know you talk about it a little bit in the book of having to absorb these different perspectives within the Black electorate.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that I wrote the book, it was really experimental. And I say this, and I think my mom's on the line and she gets mad at me when I say this, but it's true. I'm a latchkey kid, older millennial, I think is where I fall. I spend a lot of time within pop culture and watching TV and consuming certain cultural products. And so when I was writing this book, and as I was piecing together different concepts, I would constantly just be like, oh, this is like, I don't know, that episode of Saved by the Bell I watched, or this like like that. And so as I was writing the book, I was playing around with, I think, a lot of those tactics of like breaking the fourth wall, of like really letting it, what I'm thinking about, really getting, personal and identifying the awkward moments, and even having moments where like my husband, David, is kind of like, I feel like you're getting too far down the Black Republican rabbit hole and I'm going to need you to come out of that. But yeah, I think for me, I went in, I wanted to interview as many different people that had as many political perspectives as possible. And so some of those people were my family. I come from a pretty, like, in some ways, politically diverse family. Some of those were just people I did cold outreaches to, or had friends do outreach. And I would say, like, when I got into a digital space with Black MAGA people, I was expecting them to be like some of the more public Black Republicans that we see people galvanize around, that espouse a lot of really sort of anti-Black sentiments that seem to be, caping for white nationalism and certain establishment figures. And in fact, I do a chapter where I talk about those folks and then compare them to the different folks that I talk to. But what I found with these Black Republicans is that in some ways, a lot of them were a callback to the old school Black Republicans, like the Booker T. Washington, or people that today we would probably label Black Republicans, I guess they were Republicans back then, but like people that maybe didn't have the type of political identities that we play around with, today, in a time where the parties have realigned. But, your Booker T. Washingtons, like there's a lot of Thomas Sowell. I think, he's had a resurgence in online spaces. You saw people that were like libertarians that weren't necessarily fully what we would call traditional family values Republicans, but are hyper capitalists that only see capitalism and building Black capital as the only way to solve for racism. We saw people that said, no, 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 it's about a return to like family values in this like very specific biblical frame in which that means to them. And I have to say, I found myself caught off guard by how many of them felt like they were being driven by this is the right answer for Black people. And we're still speaking in the language of community, even if their sort of political leanings were taking them in different directions.
So one natural question out of a lot of this for me is, and probably people are listening, is, in some ways, what do we do with that, right? It's like, is it possible, given how media has changed? And this is one thing that was interesting as I was listening to you talk about, one of the first moments you mark in beginning your journey of Hurricane Katrina. I mean, the fact that we had a telethon that people were watching, okay? And that was a thing that was occurring is kind of wild to think about in a way, but that used to be a regular thing that we would tune in and watch telethons. And that Kanye had that platform to communicate a message, and then people were listening. Now, given big tech, given how media has just been trampled upon a local level, you've talked about the loss of community spaces. Is there a pathway for us to come together and hear these perspectives even? Because if you're not running for office, if you're not writing a book, how are you going to get the insight into where people are coming from and to be able to build power across these different perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge part of the question that actually brought me into a curiosity about antitrust work and the different work that we do, because to me, I think the only answer is a combination of local organizing and rebuilding, in a lot of ways, the sort of like local public spheres and avenues for that kind of like collective thinking. But I mean, I'll say like a couple of things. I think one, in terms of what do we do with that information? I mean, I think there's a question down here that someone's asking of like, do you think that the Black people who supported Trump in 2020 still support him? And the answer is yes. Like everything that I've seen, people have doubled down a lot on supporting Trump. There are some, in fact, a lot of the folks that I interviewed said that for them, they're not Republicans, they're Trump supporters. And if Trump's not running in 2024, they're probably not going to vote for the Republican Party. But another thing that we've seen is, I think at last check, there were like 71 Black Republicans running for, maybe it was like between 70 and 80 Black Republicans running for Congress in the 2024 midterms, which is the largest number that we've seen, I would say, in generations. And I think right now we actually might have more Black people, or as many Black people, Republicans in Congress as we've seen since like close to Reconstruction. So that's here, that's happening. There's a lot of people organizing in those spheres, and that are organizing in a really smart way, actually drawing lessons from the Obama for America organizing infrastructure in order to do it. I think that like it's really important for us to, one, understand that, to really also check how we talk about nationalism, which is another theme of the book. I think a lot of the ways in which we report and talk about nationalism in America is through this explicit lens of white nationalism and these associations with white supremacy. And I've seen, as people kind of trouble that narrative, like the Proud Boys being multiracial or a number of other things, people grappling for something that's like, it's multiracial white supremacy, which is, it's actually, no, it's a type of a nationalist identity that I think a lot of people in this country do feel and identify with, in a relationship to this idea of America, at least, and this aspirational idea of what America is supposed to be to us. And I think for many of us, we should be paying attention to how folks are talking about certain values, because I think a lot of those values conversations are being vacated and left to other entities. But when we think about populism, when we think about an economic agenda, when we think about family and safety and what we want in our communities, I think we have to be better about laying down and owning space around those definitions in a way that resonates with folks, instead of just kind of like ceding that to other entities and then allowing them to forward the narrative that government hasn't done anything for you, so the answer is not more government, it's less government, which is a very easy argument, I think, for people to be able to get to when we haven't fully seen our government live its full potential. And so I think that's the kind of work that we're always thinking about here. I'd love to hear from y'all more how that plays into some of your strategic thinking, because a lot of, I think, economic liberties work tends to live on the federal level, or with the FTC and with these other spaces. But how are you thinking about and bringing some of that grassroots or ground level thinking or experience into your strategizing in those spaces?
I can take a shot like starting that, because that I do think that one of the things that was scary to see was that like, and this also just, I think recently was it Ryan Grimm had like an article about like Republicans opening like community centers for like year round, like organizing and like, in like sort of in like, for like communities of color and like showing movie nights and other things. And I was like, oh my God, like, why aren't we, on the Democratic side, like doing that? But one of the things that, came up for me when I was reading the book was like the stories from like Black people who thought of themselves as entrepreneurs. And like, it was just like, they were so passionate about it, but they still had this sense of like, it was not just about like their idea and building their business, but also what it meant for their community. It was about, being in the community, about jobs for the community, about like creating like products and services that, serve that community that they understood so well. And for me, like it had elements, and even though often these were like Black Republicans like talking about that and saying like, government needs to get out of the way so I can do this, there was still also a sense of like linked fate, which was a concept, that you talk about how like Black people like at the end have this sense of linked fate. And that's why there's like cross-class like voting, and there has been, but we can't, again, like take that for granted. In terms of our work, the thing that made me reflect was that we've just at the federal level, I think, scratched the surface of beginning to open up what it means to like come tell your story to government. Like the FTC is having these public commission meetings, the DOJ has had it where people like, ordinary working people come and talk about how they're being impacted by the way our economy is structured. But I will be honest, it's still really hard to get people who are not your typical white male like business person to come speak, because there's fear of retaliation. It's just like, there's the networks are not deep enough sometimes to like, bring people out. And I mean, it's more complicated, but it did just sort of make me see that I was like, wait, these Black entrepreneurs are out there. Like, how do we reach them? Because they really get it in terms of like why they think, starting those businesses are important. And we need to do a better job of bringing them in, because there's a lot of like common ground. Yeah, some of them are on the Republican side, but there is like, but I think there's something there for us to like, work with.
Well, and I think that's one of the pernicious things around big tech's PR strategy is taking advantage of how deeply we care about entrepreneurism and small businesses, and making people think that they are helping Black entrepreneurs rather than actually making it so that we will never have real wealth that's going to stabilize our communities. And I think that's still, I don't know, Nidhi, if you would agree, Brandi, but that's still one of our biggest messaging challenges, to bring more of the Black electorate, regardless of party, into the space of considering antitrust competition policy as one of their key issues.
Yeah, I would say that the Republican Party has a good PR machine when it comes to how competent they are around business. Like I've even heard it from like small like business, like Black small business owners who are like, wait, are there Republicans also on this antitrust bill? Like, because then I know it's serious. And so I think that sort of like, speaks to like breaking through and saying that, we're actually going to do something on this and we have folks on board. But Brandi, what do you think of that? Like, what did you think?
I think for me, definitely, I want to give a shout out to groups like Acre and Liberation in a Generation that I know have been out there talking about these issues as well through that lens. For me, like going back to this concept of linked fate, I think one of the aha moments that I had while writing this book, which is maybe obvious and should have been obvious to me, but wasn't, but Black culture, Black American culture as this thing, as this force of power, is something that in a lot of ways is a 20th century creation. It certainly is a post-Civil War creation, because a lot of it is driven by this power to share and distribute a story of us and a story of now and what we're fighting for. And it's something that came through, you know, the distribution of newspapers. I remember, I think when I was doing this research, I found that like, you know, at peak, the Chicago Defender, a Black newspaper, I think had circulation of something like 100,000, but each paper would pass through something like 100 hands in a community and would be like, you know, kind of like held in secret. But, you know, we would have all of these shared streams and vehicles for a story that defines what it means to be Black in America and what it means to have an economic agenda. And because of segregation and the way in which neighborhoods were built, you had a lot of Black people of mixed economic status going to the same churches, shopping at the same places, frequenting the same institutions and reading the same media. And because of that, that's part of what builds this sense of linked fate, or as Dr. Dawson talks about it, this feeling of empathy for one another. It's one of the things that even if you have a Black voter, that's historically would be considered part of the, you know, top 1% of the Black economic populace, and would maybe have a vested interest in voting for policies that have tax breaks, or, you know, sort of policies that benefit the wealthy, that Black people are still more likely to vote for policies that benefit the working class economically. Or even if you see that a lot of Black people are conservatives that actually don't necessarily, in theory, believe in abortion, but they, again, believe that like the Democratic Party will better serve Black people's interests. And also they don't necessarily want that to be, you know, a choice that can be exploited by different entities. So like that drives their voting. So if you have that sense of linked fate and that shared community, that's what keeps Black people in the Democratic Party. That's what keeps Black people voting in lockstep. But when you see things like the 2008 recession, in which Black people lost 50 to 60% of Black wealth, and a lot of that was land ownership, that meant a lot of loss of businesses, that meant a lot of loss of land. What you saw more recently with the COVID recession is that a lot of businesses shut down. I was at Color of Change at the time, and we did some work around this. And I'm blanking on the different like data points around it, but a significant number of Black businesses said they didn't have the resources to make it past, you know, the first 3 months of the recession. A lot of Black businesses and Latinx businesses said that they couldn't get access to PPP, and that there were, you know, they weren't able, and even when they did, they didn't get the amount of money that they needed to survive. And yet still, despite that, they were also more likely to say that their businesses were being repurposed for multi-uses to serve the community. They were more likely to say they would rather go out of business than to open up their business and endanger their community. They still had this like tie to, you know, a community politic and uplifting. So I agree, those folks are out there and they need to be kind of brought more into the fold. But I think there's a lot of, I would say, I would venture to guess, a lot of feeling that antitrust is maybe not as important as an issue as something like criminal justice, or even what they understand to be economic justice issues. So I think that's a challenge for us, that even if they get it from a business perspective, how do you get from that to, hey, well, you should talk to the FTC, you should do some of these different things that we're asking them to do. I think they just don't feel like in the list of priorities of things that they have time to do or time to put their energy behind, that this is a thing. And the folks that feel that way tend to be the ones that are usually like sponsored by Google, unfortunately.
Wow. but I guess one reason why I am hopeful, and I wonder if you feel the same way, is, you know, it does seem like the first step in being open-minded about some of the more, you know, structural business model type changes that we're talking about is this awareness that what is going on is not working. And that's ultimately the story of the Black Skinhead that you're telling, is people that are waking up to the fact that something has been lost, that we've been sold bad bill of goods here, that the dream is not playing out for us in the right way, or as we thought, or even as our parents maybe were able to attain in a certain way. So in that way, I'm hopeful, but I don't know if if you land in that place too.
I was hopeful by the time I ended the book. It depends on the day, to be honest, right? Like, I feel like we're so bombarded with a lot of information that can make us feel like there is no hope. In some ways, that's some of the intention behind things like disinformation campaigns, which is why I still think those are important things to pay attention to, even though I know people are souring on terms like disinfo. But like, I do think that ultimately, one, people understand that things are not working. People want something different. I think that people are looking for different community spaces to rebuild. I think I've seen a couple of different models recently. I'll say capital B, I believe Baltimore Beat is a Black paper, but a lot of different like local media models that I see, community-owned local media models that are really starting to experiment with offering more diverse media choices, expansions of entrepreneurship. We definitely see, I feel like a labor movement happening. I was talking to my mom about this. She was like president of her union as a flight attendant for many years, and is very in lock with labor. She's always threatening to go work at Amazon to go help organize the workers over there in her retirement. But I do feel like we're seeing this emerging labor movement that's opening up opportunities for some of these deeper conversations. And so I do have hope around that. And I think the important thing is to make sure that those doors don't get shut, because we are always going to be, outspent. And so we can't let them out-organize us.
Yeah, that I do think that like I went through that journey with your book in terms of, at points having, I think it definitely sort of made me like sort of have a lot of like empathy for folks who were, who were Republican or even like Black MAGA and some of the things that they were saying. It scared me because I was like, oh my God, like, this is a fracturing that can so easily be exploited. And we're seeing it being exploited, right? With folks having the right, like sort of that kind of rhetoric that is appealing, not just like Trump, but some of the Republican candidates that you see now. But by the end of it, like, I think the question that I had, in the beginning of the book, you talk about this table, like, if it was a cafeteria and how, like, there are different groups in the Black sort of electorate, but at the end of it, they come to like a consensus on what is like the right policy agenda for us as like Black people. Do you think that is still like possible with folks who have moved over and become Black MAGA or Black Republicans? Like, is there like a possibility of a multiracial, sort of, we love that term, right? Multiracial, like economic coalition, at least to like start? And yeah, maybe throwing the question to you, like, what advice do you have for us in terms of, besides our allies on sort of the progressive side, to like start building those bridges?
Oof. Yeah, that's such an interesting.
That was like a stream of consciousness question.
Yeah, no, it's hard, right? Because I do think like one of the things I talk about in the book, and one of the things that I think we've talked about, is the importance of populism as a tool for organizing. And I think that there's a lot of people that either have awareness of populism, which is something that as a rhetorical and potential organizing tactic, which I talk about in the book using the example of wrestling, or people who think that like sort of inevitably a zero-sum narrative will take hold, which is where you see the kind of like skinhead fractures, this like nationalism that tells us that if one group appears to be gaining, that means that another group is losing. And so I think that like, but I do think that people are in a lot of ways, they're dissatisfied. They're tired of working 3 or 4 jobs and still not being able to make rent. They're tired of having to worry about whether their kids are going to be safe at school. You know, they're worried about big pharma. They're worried about all of these things. That they worry about flying. I know you guys just released something fairly recently around, you know, airlines and different issues. Like all of the issues that we're talking about are things that people do worry about. Like who are the right messengers for you know, spreading that with different groups? What are the right series of activations for different groups? How do we make sure that people aren't just sort of resigned? I end with this thing around you know, capital realism and that old, you know, that idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, or you know, the end of the world than the end to you know, all of these different things that we're constantly swimming up, you know, upstream against. But I have to think that like people are so ready for something different that we do have the opportunity to really offer them that. And I'm curious, I want to kick it back to you, Morgan, because I'm curious when you look back at your run, particularly maybe your congressional run, what were some of the things that you felt like, oh man, I really broke through to people on this? And either maybe with like a little more time or more turnout, I don't know what your assessment would be, like we really could have, you know, gotten this agenda through. Were there any takeaways like that you had?
Really on both. And yeah, you know, kind of building off of your response there, I think that people are ready. Messenger is so important. You know, one of the first things that I always had to point to be able to get people to engage, especially when we start talking about disaffected voters, especially disaffected Black voters, is that I'm not a politician. I don't care about being one of those forever. And in fact, I am going to agree with you that a lot of what's going on is not working. And then we can start talking about what we want to do about it. So this is where I do think it's important to have, you know, just credible messengers in that way that people don't view as just party shills, but are actually going to be real about what's happening, especially economic issues, and give a sense that you're going to fight to do something about it and be about something other than yourself. We have a trust problem fundamentally, and trust has been broken, and in some ways irrevocably for some people. But I do think for most people I talk to, once you overcome that trust barrier, they want to engage and they want to keep building. So work continues. I mean, it's crazy to think about that, especially after a couple of races that I've been through. That's like beginning of a journey of education. But I do think that because it's just become so much harder to, I think, find spaces because of the common space issue, again, for people to plug in, get information, and feel like it's what they believe in enough to then continue to want to engage. I know we're somewhat short on time, right? Is that where you're going, Nidhi?
Yeah, I was going to say we have about 5 minutes left, but just to pick up on this trust issue, one thing that I think is like really sort of like fascinating from conversations with Brandi, like a question for both of you is like, what about like, you know, corporations are still trusted a lot. Like we all have come to the conclusion that like they're terrible and that there are these villains, and yes, some folks get them. But when you were doing these interviews, when you were on the ground, like, do people actually get that corporations are controlling our lives and that they're the problem? And do they trust that government can do something? Or is it just, you know, is that really like an uphill battle there for us?
You know, it was kind of interesting. Like the Black MAGA people that I talked to were actually way less trusting of corporations, which again, may be like a sort of obvious thing. Black leftists were very mistrustful of corporations. It's kind of like that oversized middle. That even if they have questions about them, it's more like a resignation to them. But I think one of the things that, you know, it's important for us to understand is that there is a long history of corporations, you know, stepping in and putting their hand on the scale on behalf of Black people, you know, in a number of situations where government has fallen short. And one of the examples that I give is like in the building of Atlanta, and how MLK was getting the Nobel Peace Prize. And in the community, they were going to have an event in Atlanta, and everybody in the community was saying that they weren't going to come. All the white business owners and different things were saying they weren't going to come, and that they weren't going to support what MLK was doing. And the mayor at the time was like, I don't have any power. I don't know what to do. And it was the CEO of Coca-Cola that actually put his hand on the scale and brought all of those folks into the room. And that's kind of one of those moments. So you think about Sears as a catalog where because it was a catalog and people were able to order from it in the early part of the 20th century, there wasn't price gouging. There wasn't all of the issues that Black people had to deal with the local white business owner or monopoly. And so Sears in a lot of ways became a savior for Black communities, and we're selling, I think even Black toys and different things at a time when local businesses weren't. So it is a very complicated relationship that Black people have historically had with corporations for that reason. I don't think that it's an unbreakable relationship. I think we've certainly seen over time entities like Comcast and more recently Facebook. I think I was reading there's like a large exodus of Black people off of Facebook. Like we see people recognizing that these companies are not doing the best thing for our communities, but it takes a lot of organizing, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of messaging, and we can't just tell people don't do this thing. We have to have an affirmative vision or affirmative place for people to be able to go. And I think that's one of the challenges that we're definitely dealing with a lot. How are we, it's very easy. I think I heard someone say recently, it's very easy to like message around the status quo and keeping people in the status quo. And that's what a lot of people are really good at. It's a lot harder to get people to believe in something that they haven't seen before, and to be able to view a painting that has never really been painted before. And so I think that's the challenge that we constantly have. How are we telling people that another world is possible, and then painting the picture of what another world looks like beyond corporations and corporate power?
That was beautiful. And we're almost out of time. Morgan, did you have?
Yeah, I do have one last question because I want to honor your mama. And so I'm curious about how did she feel about your sharing a story in her related to Playboy? And does she currently identify as a Black skinhead?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So my mom, so like we didn't really get to a lot of this, but I draw from a lot of personal memoir in the book. So I have a lot of interviews and stories of my dad and my mom and all of this stuff. My mom was pretty open about sharing that. She was also very clear. She modeled for Playboy's clothing line. So she had her clothes on. She went to the Chicago Playboy mansion, but it was none of that foolery kind of thing. But, I think one of the most fun, I would say the silver lining to this process, I think if people read the book, they'll see there are a lot of devastating aspects to it that I go through. But one of the heartening things about doing the book is that it gave me an opportunity to see different members of my family, particularly my parents, in a way that I hadn't gotten a chance to see before. And I heard a lot of stories with her, and she was very generous with sharing a lot of stories with me, some of which didn't make this book. If God willing, I'm able to make a second book. Hopefully those will go in there. But it really, it gave me a chance to understand her as an organizer around housing, as, what the work that she did in labor, like some of the work that she did at Bethlehem Steel, a number of different things that again didn't make the book. But yeah, she's a little fancy with it. If I could pop her on video, she'd probably be done up with her leopard print rug in the back and her like Waterford glass. So she didn't mind people knowing that she was on that vibe. She had it. She still got it.
Nice.
Yeah, I was definitely like, I want to meet Brandi's mom after reading the book. Can we have brunch with her and talk about this book?
Part two.
Yeah. Well, we're at the hour. Any final thoughts, Brandi, before I wrap up?
No, I mean, thank you guys for having me on. It's been an honor. I have such a deep respect for the work, and I think Economic Liberties and Acre were the two places where I first even came to understand why some of these issues are important. So I appreciate you guys for opening up this opportunity to talk about the book.
No, thank you so much. I mean, you were been incredibly generous with your time and really incredibly generous in the book with your personal story. Like we didn't get into that, but the G chats, even like the answer about like your marriage, it was all beautiful. And I will say that you should make a playlist because I was like adding songs that you were naming from the book onto like a Spotify list. So that should be part of your marketing.
I got you.
Yeah, but this was great. So
And don't leave the playlist to ALP.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining. You can pre-order Black Skinhead, from your local independent bookshop. It's coming out in September. Do you have a date, Brandi, for exactly?
September 20th.
September 20th. So mark that date. And thanks. And we'll see you all next month.
Bye. Thanks, Brandi.
Bye.